My name's DanLawrence. I'm a human performance coach and head of performance at Matchroom Boxing. I've coached over 30 champion athletes from NFL Super Bowl winners, undisputed boxing champions, and numerous Premier League footballers. Today's video, I'm going to discuss how to build a world champion. I've had the pleasure of working with Joe Cordina, the IBF super featherweight champion of the world, two-time world champ, and also Josh Taylor, when he beat Jose Ramirez for the undisputed championship of the world. So we're going to start with giving you a broad overview of my thought process to build a world champion boxer. And it all starts, before we go into the X's and O's of programming, it starts with your team. It starts with what are you doing currently before you can then make decisions moving forwards. So when I got the head of performance at Matchroom Boxing role, which was 6.5 years ago now, I didn't go in with a bull in a china shop mentality and give them 20, 30 things to do. Even though I knew there was so many things we could do to really optimize their performance. I sat there on the ring rope and I just looked around. I absorbed, I spoke to them and saw what they were doing. That was a winning gym before I even set foot in it, under the great work and guidance of Tony Sims, the head coach. But I knew to unlock a new level, they had to do something a little bit differently. So the first thing we did with those guys was to really optimize recovery. So we got lots of data around their heart rate training zones. At the time, they didn't really know what they were getting from certain training sessions from a physiological, bioenergetic point of view. So we all got them heart rate monitors, and then we saw, what their sparring sessions were giving, what zones they were in, how long they were in each zone, before we could then make an intervention to see other areas that they needed to improve. Equally, from a strength and conditioning point of view, they really weren't doing a lot 6.5 years ago. Obviously, it's changed a hell of a lot now. And back then it was, it was very new for a lot of fighters. So to get that buy-in is something I'll talk about as well, was tricky on the front end, but the guys really bought in and have had great results over the years. So going into our broad overview, the team is vitally important, and that all comes from the head coach. Everything feeds into the head coach, and they make the final decision on everything. Thankfully, I've worked with some of the best head coaches around, Tony Sims, Ben Davison, plus many others. And we have such a good relationship, and we have, as Dr. Fergus Connolly talks about in Game Changer, synergy between different departments. This is an athlete-centered model. It has to be. It can't just be the head of performance, the strength and conditioning coach, and then you've got a physio, then you've got a nutritionist, then you've got the head coach, and no one talks to each other. So everything we do feeds into the head coach. The head coach is very vocal and on comms with myself, and then together we manage the athlete accordingly. The big thing I did early on at Matchroom was to optimize recovery. So we pulled back in certain areas. I of course chose my battles, it wasn't going in and saying, oh, you've got to have recovery here, you can't do that session, don't do that run, because again, they probably early on think, who's this guy to tell me that? But over time, I earned their trust, got their buy-in, and they realized that actually pulling back at certain times was the great way to optimize overall performance. Something I did with Josh Taylor was for the undisputed fight. He is very on the go all of the time, always wants to make those marginal gains, go, 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 go. But with that, there's another side. And the other side is there's a cost. If you don't optimize recovery, you're going to burn out and you're actually not going to reach that peak performance level. So we optimized his sleep, the #1 recovery tool that costs absolutely nothing. And we did that through objectivity. So this was now, as I shoot this video, 3 years ago. It was in preparation for a May fight, I think late May 2021 in Las Vegas against Jose Ramirez for the undisputed championship of the world. All of the marbles in the 140-pound division. Thankfully, Josh won the fight, but early on, we identified recovery optimization had to be improved. So we got him an Aura ring. At first, he did not want to wear it. And the first time he did wear it, his finger swelled up and he couldn't get the bloody thing off. But anyway, he eventually started wearing it. He then passed that data over to me. I then analyzed the data, passed it over to Ben. Myself and Ben Davis and Lee Wiley had a great relationship there. And if, for example, Josh was meant to spar 12 rounds on that day, which again is a high stress, and his recovery was very, very low, so let's say 30 out of 100 recovery, I would pass that information over to Ben, and together we'd make the decision as to whether 12 rounds then became 8 rounds. Because again, from a physiological, but you've also got a psychological point of view. If a fighter is due to do 12 rounds, their recovery is terrible, and they go in, they don't have a good spar, what does that then do to them from a psychological point of view? They might anchor that into the next spar, the next training session, and then this builds up of like, oh, am I really doing the right thing? Am I really getting where I need to go from a performance optimization point of view ahead of the biggest fight of my life? So this is where you have to have that synergy again, going back to Dr. Fergus Connolly in Game Changer. You have to have synergy between different departments, and it all has to be centered around one thing, and that's the athlete. So no egos, the athlete is the primary focus, and that's something that we did very, very well ahead of the Undisputed fight, was to be all on the same page, and thankfully Josh got his arm raised on fight night to become Undisputed Champion of the world. So the big thing here is dose response. As I said at Matchroom, I didn't go in with a bull in a china shop mentality. We were identifying how can we recover these athletes and help them recover better. So again, it wasn't going in and getting a Whoop, getting an Aura ring, getting a heart rate monitor, doing 20 things. It was 1 or 2 things, get the buy-in, earn the trust, and then we build on that. We do 2 more, we do 2 more. And then over the 6-month period early on, we got huge buy-in, they saw huge results, and then, you know, they'll do whatever you ask them to do. Goes back to an athlete doesn't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So dose response is vitally important. If you do not recover, you're not going to be able to apply more stress. So getting the right stress at the right time, recovering optimally, is vitally important. Our 4 pillars at Perform 365, my coaching program, are very simple: training, nutrition, recovery, and mindset. We merge training and nutrition together hand in glove. It's all well and good being fueled for your training sessions, which is of course what we ask our athletes to do. But we're in a sport that's governed by making weight. So certain days have to be a low day from a fueling point of view, and certain days need to be a higher day with high energy availability from a fueling point of view. So that might look like Monday, Wednesday, Friday, the sparring days. They're tough days, they're high training days. So we actually need to be fueled appropriately for those. Going back to the Josh Taylor of, if you have a bad spar, how does that impact your psychology going into the next one? So we want them fueled for those. They are the most important thing. Something we say in high performance is keep the main thing the main thing. Keep the goal the goal. The main thing in boxing is of course boxing. Strength and conditioning is just a supplement to the boxing to build a more robust athlete, to improve physical preparation, but boxing is the main thing. So our higher days are Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but Tuesday, Thursday, and then Saturday, Sunday, we go slightly lower from an energy availability point of view and carbohydrate point of view. So you need to be quite strategic with that. So you can pair your training and nutrition, 2 of our pillars, together hand in glove. And then of course, training and recovery needs to be merged together as well. You can only train as hard as to what you can recover from. So we need to really optimize your recovery to then feed into your training as well. Otherwise you'll simply burn out. We've seen it done before. You've got to get your recovery right and get that sleep right as the #1 recovery tool that costs absolutely nothing. Of course, these days there's other recovery modalities out there, but sleep is the big rock. Nail your sleep and then you can chase these smaller marginal gains like cryotherapy, hot and cold immersion, saunas, etc. Our final pillar at Perform 365 is mindset. Thankfully, lots of the boxers do have a really strong mindset, but still, because of the macho bravado of boxing, you haven't got 10 other teammates backing you up if you have a bad day at the office. You're quite literally on your ass, and some of my athletes have been over the years. That's, you know, part and parcel of the sport and why we love it, I suppose, is that they don't want to talk to people a lot of the time. Thankfully, these days, I've seen a big shift over the past 12 months. They're being a lot more open to showing an element of vulnerability to their closer team, because that's important. When you get the buy-in and trust from them, you can't have them guarding and bottling everything up. We use the volcano analogy because if they do, it just builds, it builds, it builds, and then it erupts. And that might look like a defeat in the ring, or it could look like an injury in camp because they just haven't expressed how they feel. So we really have an open line of communication and again, synergy between the team, so that the athlete needs to be very open and honest with us of how they're feeling, so we can then make the intervention at the right time. The 4 coactive model, as popularized by Cameron Josh, formerly working with Joe DeFranco, a very sharp dude, is tactical, technical, physical, and psychological preparation. I've mentioned a few of them there. So the tactical preparation, I leave that to the head coach. That's exactly what they do, and that is so, so important. The technical preparation, again, of course, in the strength and conditioning realms, we do look at the technical component that will then feed into potentially improving punch power, punch mechanics, and transfer of energy through the kinetic chain from foot through to fist. We then have physical preparation. That's obviously something that we do certainly take care of. And then psychological preparation. I mentioned it there. Sometimes they do have mindset coaches and you know, sometimes they don't, but we do have quite in-depth conversations around the human psychology element. Because it is such a high-octane sport where they don't have 10 other teammates, nailing their mindset is very, very important. So this 4 coactive model is a broad overview of the key components that will drive performance forwards. Now we can look at the broad overview of the training block. So this can of course change. The duration of these phases can change depending on the fighter. If you've got a fighter who's maybe only had 2 or 3 fights, they're on the come up, they're going to fight more frequently than someone who's had 20, 25 fights and they're on the cusp of world title honours. So the duration of these phases change, and it also depends when you come back into camp and how you come back into camp. We don't want our fighters coming back into camp, so it then means we've got to do fat camp for the first 4 weeks. Thankfully, we do set an upper limit, of where we want them to be, and if they go over that, we've got to have a conversation about that, because otherwise we're not going to build these physical qualities. It really does just turn into fat camp early on. Thankfully, my guys are super professional, so we haven't had to have too many of those conversations. There's been 1 or 2. GPP simply stands for General Physical Preparedness or Preparation. That is laying the foundations. Laying the foundations with high reps and low load. So again, if you imagine the stressor response, dose response phenomenon, if they've come back into camp, they probably haven't done a lot for 3, 4, 5 weeks, sometimes even more than that. If that's the case, moving into like a strength and power block right away out the gate, I'm sure we'd agree would probably be a little bit too much in terms of stress. Too much load we're putting on the system. We've got to gradually build the mountain, so to speak, and accumulate more volume over time so the body doesn't break down. Something we also say is an athlete's best ability is availability. Injured athletes aren't any good to anyone. Of course, it happens in such a chaotic sport, but our role as physical preparation and performance coaches is to best mitigate the potential of an athlete getting injured. And that's where a properly structured program and a deep understanding of physical preparation is fundamental. So the GPP phase, we're looking at tissue tolerance, tendon health. So how are the tissues? Do we expose them to 3 or 4 reps under heavy load at this point? No. We're looking at high repetitions, 15 to 20 reps, to start just building that tissue tolerance, to getting them used to that stress at the time. Tendon tolerance as well. So we're looking at extensive plyometrics, things like pogos, you probably see my guys do, spring and reactive on the floor, nothing too crazy at that point. And going back to plyometrics as well, we're looking at more kind of eccentric absorption, force absorption qualities before we then work through our plyometric continuum, looking at slow to fast stretch shortening cycle movements. So there's a real pyramid of hierarchy here, and they've got to earn the right to progress. But this early phase is pretty basic. I'll be honest, a lot of my guys don't enjoy it because there's, as I say, high reps on a split squat. We've all been there. They're not the most fun exercise, but they do understand the why behind it, because, I bore them with that, but they buy into it because they understand this is a necessary evil, a necessary part of the process before we can then do the funner stuff, the shifting heavy load and the explosive work that they enjoy. In terms of the trunk, we look at a lot of anti-movements at this stage, so buffering forces on the spine. Yes, we do a lot of reactive trunk work later down the line and certainly closer to fight night, but they've got to learn how to absorb force and also not bleed energy through the midline. So things like your Palloff presses, your dead bug variations, just to build that midline stability and control is really important from an education point of view for the athlete in this phase. After the GPP phase, which could last 4 weeks, sometimes it lasts 2 weeks, but again, going back to what I said, it depends where the athlete comes back into camp and of course how long we've got from a start of camp to an end of camp fight date point of view. Strength and hypertrophy. I've written this on here, but a lot of our fighters won't go through too much of an extensive hypertrophy phase because they've got to make weight to fight. So it really depends on the fighter. If a fighter's going up in weight, then absolutely we can go through a hypertrophy phase. But generally speaking, we won't do too much from a volume point of view because we've got to be really mindful of how much, they put on from a weight making point of view. So this is where the change from the GPP into the strength and hypertrophy, as you can see, high reps in phase 1, phase 2, there's a huge shift in reduction of reps. So now we might be looking at 3 to 5 reps at north of 85% of 1 rep max. And the load, as I mentioned there, is substantially higher. So low reps, high load, and this is where we're looking to improve and raise upper limit of force production. Remember, force times velocity equals power. We want more powerful athletes. So this is where I say to my guys, this will make you more explosive. Right, coach, I'm in, tell me what I've got to do. So some of the exercises we do here would be big compound movements. You may have seen me use like a trap bar deadlift with my guys, heavy back squats for some of the guys. And the goal, as I say, is to raise up a limit of force production so that when we surf the force velocity curve and we're trying to move the curve to the right, we've got more to pull from so we can then make them more explosive, powerful athletes. Plyometrics now get a little bit more advanced. We're looking at more kind of counter movement jumps, squat jumps, one of which utilizes the stretch shortening cycle, the other doesn't. We're still doing some form of extensive plyos at this point, building some tolerance around there, around the tendon, quick ground contact times. And if we have got the luxury of going through more hypertrophy work, where we're trying to improve muscle cross-sectional area and skeletal muscle hypertrophy. We're trying to activate and increase the hormone IGF-1, which obviously comes through the dietary intake as well. Then we'll look at exercises that are going to drive that response from a muscular hypertrophy point of view. But I must stress, this hasn't been done a hell of a lot with my fighters. I had one fighter, he went from light heavyweight to cruiserweight, which is the biggest difference between weights. So we did have the luxury of that. And that was like the chase the pump sessions alongside doing lots of strength work. He thoroughly enjoyed it, but of course the nutritional intervention needed to be aligned with that. So he was actually in more of a caloric surplus than some other fighters that I've worked with over the years. After strength and hypertrophy, we move into strength and power. So again, this is where the reps are low, the load is high for the strength aspect, but then for the kind of power or speed aspect, we go with low load. So this is where we work different aspects of the force velocity curve. This is where we're looking at more kind of dynamic strength, elastic reactive component. The plyometric continuum now, we're looking at real kind of fast stretch shortening cycle movements whilst they've built that tolerance. Quick ground contact times, we do a lot around the calf and lower limb in these early phases, so those ground contacts should now be quicker. Their body's accustomed to it, and this is where we're really starting to sharpen the knife, and they're feeling great as we get closer to fight night. The trunk, we're looking at more reactive work now. We're looking at the kind of contract relax mechanisms. A lot of the landmine work where we come out, we contract relax. We do a lot around the medicine balls as well. So you can see an element of specificity starting to creep in this phase. Though we're not falling too far down the specificity rabbit hole, we're still building general qualities, but you'll see things that get a little bit more specific towards boxing as well now. Something we use throughout the course of camp, not so much in the GPP phase, but certainly in the strength and hypertrophy and strength and power phase and the taper phase, is VBT. VBT simply stands for velocity-based training, popularized by Dan Baker back in the day. I went on a course with him about 9 years ago. Chris Toombs, my friend, did a number of courses and still does. And also Brian Mann's data has been revolutionary for the high performance space. And we're looking at more kind of strength speed at this stage, looking at 1 to 1.3 ms. And that's basically how quickly you move that load, the velocity of it. And we use kind of monitors, we put them on the bar, and we can see and use that objectivity to drive our decision-making process. The great thing about velocity-based training comparatively to percentage of 1RM is the fact that an athlete today may be very different to an athlete in 3 days' time. What do I mean by that? If they're in a chronic state of fatigue today, they've had poor sleep, they've had a row with their spouse, they haven't fueled adequately, they're fatigued from previous training loads, 85% on today may be very different to 85% in 3 days' time. So this is where velocity-based training can actually give us that greater specificity of how the athlete presents on that day, and then we can also regulate accordingly on the basis of whether they are fatigued and the load is not created equal on certain days. So they might on the first day be able to do 80 kilos at that, and then the next day they might be doing 90 kilos. So that's where velocity-based training can certainly give us that greater level of detail and objectivity to drive our decision-making process. So the reps here again are low, but the quality of work is high. The intensity is high. It's very, very pure work. We're not going into any conditioning BS here. This is all about quality of work. And then we move into the taper phase. So the taper phase we use in boxing can anywhere between 10 and 14 days. The research supports anywhere between around 21 days, and then it's a progressively reduced rate of bringing volume down as you get closer to fight night, game day, or the event. So 41 to 60% reduction in total volume over time. And again, the research does support 21 days, but we tend not to do it that far out. We tend to work off around 10 to 14 days where we gradually start reducing volume. And this is where we're really just sharpening the knife. We use the words peaking as the hard work's been done. The qualities now we're looking to really just focus on optimization of recovery to allow for supercompensation to occur. And supercompensation, guys, is super simple, okay? So say, here's the athlete, that's their baseline. When you expose a stress to the system, I think we'd all agree they go below baseline, they're in a fatigue state. But then, providing we get all of these methods right in terms of recovery optimization, they start coming up, and then, if we get it right, they peak and go above baseline. And that's what supercompensation is. And there is an art to this. It's not like a one-size-fits-all approach, which is why I say, yes, the literature says 21 days, but we have seen with certain guys that we want to taper slightly differently, 41 to 60%. That's quite a broad amount. So again, you've got to do what's right for the athlete, get their feedback, but use the data, the objectivity, like VBT, to actually inform the decision-making process to see whether that athlete is peaking at that time. And if you do get it right, you're going to see an improvement in performance come fight night, which is the aim of the game here. So this really is a broad overview on how to build a world champion. I've had the pleasure of working with a number of them. In future videos, I will give you specifics in terms of the training, but this is a broad overview, and hopefully you enjoyed this video. Like, subscribe, and if you have any questions, drop them below.